This is John Maggiore from MaggioreOnBowie.com. I am here today as a special guest of Marc Lowe on his YouTube page. But before we get into the discussion today of Marc's new album, Before and After COVID, let me just tell you how we got here. So I write a daily blog about David Bowie, MaggioreOnBowie.com, and there's a feature that I do that's called Cover of the Week, which I do every week, where I find a David Bowie cover that I feature, that I like, that I write about. And a while back, I found a cover of a David Bowie song that Marc did online, and I featured it. And I thought it was terrific. And earlier this year in 2024, I added a new feature to my blog, which was a weekly interview segment. And I had asked Marc if I could interview him, and he was, in fact, the second person I interviewed. And that was a terrific written interview. Since then, I've had an interview every week on MaggioreOnBowie.com. And recently, Marc and I recorded an interview in two parts about David Bowie that has yet to post. So if you're seeing this, come back to MaggioreOnBowie.com later in the month of July to see us discuss David Bowie. And I'll leave the specific topics a little bit of a mystery, so you can find out on your own. But we also wanted to talk about Marc's original works, and he has quite a few original works. He's a prolific musician among many other pursuits, including teaching, including he posted video essays on all manner of topics, and he's just an all-around creative person. But we're going to focus this discussion on his latest album, which is called Before and After COVID. So, Marc, thank you for agreeing to this, and thank you for having me on your YouTube page.
Thank you.
So, Marc, let's get right into it. Before we speak about the album itself, let's talk about the context. We all experienced a pandemic in 2020 and for months and years after that was profound. It changed the world. It changed all of our lives. 2020, in my experience, was the worst year of my life. And all sorts of bad stuff came out of it. But I live in Albany, New York. You live in Japan. And were you in Tokyo during the height of the pandemic?
Yes,
what was that like? What happened there?
Yeah, let me give some backstory on that too, in terms of my own situation, because interestingly enough, I had lived in a place in the south part of Japan, Kyushu, southern island, called Fukuoka, Fukuoka, it's spelled in English, Fukuoka, that's how it's pronounced. And I was teaching at university there full time for 8 years. I had 3 contracts in a row, basically, and I was there full time. And I moved to Tokyo in October of 2019, before the pandemic, for work, because my final contract there ended. And Tokyo has many more universities. And actually, Kyushu University, to give some background, is like the top level university in Kyushu. So the only place I figured I could go from there, and I had been full-time, that was gone, was down, and it would have been part-time at a lower level school. I thought, well, this may be the opportunity to move to a place like Tokyo, bigger city. And also because I do music, obviously we're going to be talking about that tonight. Tonight on my end and your morning. Good morning, John. It's evening here. It was just an opportunity, right? Because there are many universities here, many, top level or high level universities, and so more chances. So I moved with my partner at the time, who I had been with for some time at that stage, to Tokyo in October of 2019. And once I got here, I started looking for work. I started finding some part-time work, a little bit, getting acclimated to Tokyo. We were living together, as I said, and I was doing some music, getting to know some people at the live houses, this kind of thing. 2020 comes, and we start getting word of, right, there's this weird virus from China, and of course Japan is closer to China, and so at that time it was really like, we have a history, there's the history in Japan, China, Korea, this area, East Asia, there were several years ago, there was a SARS, SARS. I don't know if you remember this.
Yes. Oh,
Kind
yeah.
of, right? And so, in fact, here's another story, another backstory, kind of connected in a way. I haven't thought about this in a while, actually. But when SARS hit East Asia, when it was really bad and in the news and that kind of thing, it was in the 2000s. I was supposed to come as a teaching assistant. I was a graduate student studying Japanese literature in university at Colorado, Boulder, Colorado. And I was chosen to go as a, teaching assistant with the professors and the undergraduates come to China and Japan, that I would be the tour guide for the Japan half, because I could speak some Japanese, that kind of stuff. And then the people from the Chinese department would do for the China half, but I would accompany both halves and they would accompany both halves. It was for like 2 weeks or something, or 3 weeks. It was like a summer thing. And because of SARS, I never did go on that trip. So I've never been to China. Okay. That was SARS, right? So, when COVID hits, it's in China. And so in Japan, we're like, wait a minute, is this going to be another SARS, or is it going to be worse than SARS? Nobody, I think, could have imagined that COVID would have been a worldwide pandemic.
Right.
Like it would go to, that New York would be affected, that, the whole world literally would be affected by this thing. So yeah, so 2019, I come here, 2020, there's kind of word of this virus going around, and, you kind of don't want to be paranoid. All right. And some people are starting to wear masks because in Japan, it's a culture where people are sort of used to wearing masks anyway. People wear them, before COVID, people were wearing masks because they have allergies, seasonal allergies, or if they caught a cold, they'd wear a mask or something like this kind of thing. Elderly people. Not everyone was wearing masks, obviously, but so people start wearing masks a little bit earlier here, I think, than say in the US, where people were not accustomed to that. And now to bring it into 2020 and COVID, when the first wave so-called hit, which was actually around March in Japan. Actually, in February, the month prior to that, I was still living with the same now ex-girlfriend, and we were having some problems actually. But I had gone to Fukuoka to see my friends, because I had been living there before, and to do a live show on my birthday, which is February 26th. I turned 40, what was it? 48 or something, right? I turned 50 last year, so do the math here. 2020. Yeah, so I went and I did a live show and everything. And at that time, there was some people saying, this COVID thing, but nobody was yet wearing masks and I was yet too concerned. I come back and I did one last show. I'll never forget. It was March 15th. And I thought to myself, this may be my last show. And I said to my partner who I was living with, this might be my last show, huh? Because of COVID. And it was for a period of time. So one way that it affected people such as myself who were musicians doing shows and things, we couldn't do shows anymore, right? Everyone was,
Right.
live spaces were hit really hard, because if you sing, and I'm a singer too, right? As you know, I sing in addition to doing instruments. Singing was the worst, they said, right? Because your breath is coming, and if you have spittle coming, so they put up the things and everyone wearing masks and, putting the alcohol in their hands kind of thing. That's March 15th was my last show locally. So February 26th, my birthday, I did in Fukuoka. I did a birthday show. I come back 2.5, 3 weeks later. I do my final show for half a year. And then now to get into the personal part, what happened during COVID. So COVID starts to hit and COVID starts to get worse. Like March, we start getting the warnings from the government about traveling locally on the trains, wear a mask, shodoku. I'm using Japanese in my head, so I'm trying to translate here. Shodoku is, the alcohol in the hands. And
Right.
open the windows on the trains, open the windows in the classrooms. And then it got worse, right? Even more. My place where I was living at the time with my ex was even farther from the downtown area than I'm in now. And I'm still kind of distant. So I'd have to travel for over an hour on the train. And I was concerned about this with COVID. So I ended up losing the job that I had just gotten because I couldn't travel there and they didn't have a Zoom thing set up. The one university where I got my first university position, I'm still working at the same university several years now. They did have a Zoom setting like we're doing now. So I could work from home, but it was only 1 day a week. And the other job I lost because of that. And
Right.
then it was hard to get more work. It was really bad timing in that sense. You talk about the worst year of your life. 2020 was also the worst year of my life. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more. It does connect to another album that I know you listen to. We're not going to discuss
Yeah.
in detail today, which kind of deals with that. But this is 4 years ago, John. That's not a recent event. Which was, I broke up with the woman I was living with, and I moved to my current living space. And this actually does connect with the album that I think you're going to be asking me about, which is my most recent work before and after COVID, because,
Right.
and maybe I should save that for later. Might be one of your questions, but this is kind of how it connects, because I moved out, I had the breakup, I moved out, I lost work, right? And to be frank with you, I was in a very, very, very bad mental state. Very bad. I was alone then, had broken up, was actually living in temporary housing temporarily during the breakup. And it was during the time, it was our first in Tokyo. This goes back to COVID. We didn't have a lockdown because the Japanese government cannot, by law, have a lockdown. They can't have a literal lockdown.
There was never a lockdown during the pandemic?
No, but what we had was called the state of emergency.
Yeah.
And what the state of emergency is in Tokyo was one of the first, and it spread out, was, again, well, firstly, a lot of the stores, restaurants shut down, just like everywhere else, just like I'm sure you experienced in New York. They couldn't say lockdown. They can't do that by law, but they can say, we strongly, strongly, strongly advise you not to leave home. We strongly, strongly, strongly advise you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And basically all the stores were shutting down and nothing was open and people were scared and the trains were empty and it was ghost town in Tokyo, like New York, right? Ghost town. So basically during that first wave, we had the first state of emergency. It wasn't a lockdown, it's a state of emergency, and it was scary. And I was in the middle of a breakup and moving out of my home and scared and a mess mentally and in every way you can imagine. And I hadn't been living in Tokyo long, don't know many people. I'm basically on my own. I'm basically now having this whole, like traumatic thing emotionally, plus not enough work, plus I can't get work, plus I'm all this stuff. And it's going to connect with the music. Before getting into, I'm going to let you ask the questions.
Yeah.
But maybe I should just ...
Yeah. Okay. So look,
the
reason I asked was because, we both mentioned the title of the album, Before and After COVID, and I thought that it was important to set the scene and establish the context. And before we get into the album, one sort of other general question about the pandemic. Do you think it? So, I'm sorry to do the talking here, but
no, you should. Please do.
The reason I'm asking this question is, in the United States and in New York State, where I live, the attitudes about the experience were very divided, and yes, it very. There are a lot of people who, at no point recognized what was happening to be a near existential crisis, and there are others that did. And COVID has not left us. There's still, thousands of people have died of COVID this year already around the world, and it's become almost a routine disease to get. Obviously, it's less deadly and there's better treatment for it. My question for you is, do you think we learned the wrong lessons now that we're past the worst of it as a society? I don't mean you and me learned the wrong lessons.
No, I understand. That's a really big question, but it's a good one. Yeah. And it's moving away from music, but I'm interested in this very much. And actually, let me say a couple things because I'm in a slightly unique position in the sense that I'm an American or expat from New Jersey, which is your neighbor. And I've been to New York. Albany, I think I told you. And so I understand the political stuff around COVID in the US, and I also understand why, to some degree, that is culturally, as an American living in Japan, and also I'm seeing the Japan side, obviously living here. And the difference is, it wasn't so much a political issue here in terms of like, we have our freedoms, we don't have to wear masks because we don't want to, or in America, I'm saying, right? This kind of thing with and I know, and also I know your background in the politics, and I know Trump was right in office, and
Yeah.
he was actually, this made its way as a sample into my music from 2020. I don't think you've heard this before. I did a collaboration with someone via the computer where I put a sample in of Trump talking about Americans must have their freedoms. In other words, he was saying they're free to choose not to mask if they don't want to, or free
Yeah.
not to vaccine if they don't want to, kind of thing. So I know it's a big political issue, and I know in America, and I know that
Yeah.
I've heard from people, because obviously I'm still connected in some ways to some people in the US, and who like lost friends over the fact that actually the same in Japan. I'm going to answer your question, but I'm doing it a little bit roundabout
Yeah.
because I had a friend that never wore a Japanese guy who never wore a mask during the entire pandemic, didn't get the vaccine by choice. That's a little bit rare because almost all Japanese, like 90+% of the population, followed the rules, masked, did the hand washing and all that stuff, because Japan, number one, firstly, Japan's a society that's very, very, very concerned with cleanliness.
Yeah.
And that's from ancient times. Okay. The bathhouses, like going to bathe and clean yourself in the religious tradition, the Shinto, which is the native, not Buddhism, but the native Japanese kind of religion, or it's not even religion almost, but it's, you go and you do your thing. There's a thing about cleanliness. When you enter this is not Buddhism, they're different. When you enter a Shinto shrine in Japan, the first thing you do is you wash your hand. There's a water, and you wash your hands. It's both symbolic and literally, you're cleaning yourself, but you're also purifying before you enter the pure space, kind of thing. The priests, if you will, that's not really the right word for it, but they wear white, like a woman would wear a white wedding gown that symbolizes a kind of, it's cleanliness. And in sumo, if you know sumo, the big guys who wrestle,
Right.
it's actually, yeah.
In New York, we say sumo.
Sumo, right? I say sumo, right? Because I'm using the Japanese pronunciation. Sumo, right? Exactly. Sumo wrestling, right?
Yeah.
That is actually connected to Shinto. And what you can see there, if you look, in the beginning, they take a bit of salt and they go with the salt. Salt purifies, it's clean.
Yeah.
When you enter home in Japan, you take your shoes off. First thing, you do not enter with your shoes ever. That's for cleanliness, because you're dragging in dirt and bacteria from outside, and people can't imagine Americans get into their bed with shoes on. That's like, no way. And when you bathe in Japan, not just the bath houses, but like if you're before you get into the bath, if you take a bath, many Americans shower in the morning, and that's fine. But the first thing is people bathe at night before they get into bed, because the idea of getting into bed after you're sweating and you're out with your clothes all day is unheard of. So why I'm giving all this background is cultural. Also, it's a mask culture. That's normal. You get sick, you have a cold, you don't want to give a cold to someone else because it's so crowded, right? You're on the trains, sneezing in someone's neck because you see my posts on Facebook how much I hate the trains. You're crushed like a there's a Radiohead song about crushed like sardines in a tin can. That's Tokyo subway, okay? And even other parts of Japan, it's just crowded. There's a lot of people, dense, right? So, wear a mask if you have a cold. Or if you have allergies, Japanese people believe, okay. So one of the reasons that was posited that Japan had less of an intense COVID experience, though people died, and actually Japan has the highest percentage of elderly people in the world. We're the fastest aging population in the world, and it's a huge problem. So elderly people are more prone, obviously, to dying of COVID or a cold or anything, right? So, but oddly, Japan had lower numbers than New York. Japan had lower numbers than India. Japan had lower numbers than almost anywhere. And one reason positive is Japanese people used to wearing masks. Japanese people used to washing the hands everywhere they go. And every single store you go into, restaurant or anything, there's a bottle sitting there with alcohol. Wash your hands. Even now. And even now, people are wearing masks. A lot of it, it's not for COVID. Actually, it's another reason that they don't want to show their faces. That's actually another cultural thing. But and it's kind of actually sad. But I don't want to go into that. It
Yeah.
might come up later because actually it could be part of the cultural part of the album. But so getting back to COVID, your question I have not forgotten is, did we learn the right lessons or not?
Yeah.
That's actually, I go into that. It's going to be a really, really long conversation, which is
Okay.
okay. But no, it's very interesting. Yes and no.
Yeah.
And
Well, let's pivot to the album because I think part of the
yeah,
reason I asked the question is
yeah,
in my in my listening to the album, that question was inspired in part by listening to the album.
yeah, I'd
And
like to
I'll
hear
tell you
your
one,
response. Yeah.
yeah, I'll tell you one other impression that I had, and then I'm going to very slightly pivot and ask you a very broad question about the album by way of leading into it.
Yeah.
Part of what I think that album is about, maybe the dominant theme is isolation. And I thought about the name too. And I think that the name sort of sets the stage for the listener to contemplate what it is, for me, just my own experience listening to it. What is it that I'm listening to? And I took from the arc of the album that it sort of plunges us into a sense of isolation. And there's a point sort of in the middle where it seems like we're getting out, but we don't fully get out. And so,
Welcome to my world. Yeah. The dark
yeah.
world.
So, it's, how much worse is the world today as a result of what we got out of this collective experience? And that's a question, but let me ask an even broader question. How would you describe the album?
Hmm. That's an easy question for me to answer, the second one.
Yeah.
But should I start with the first one or the second
No,
one?
no. Start with the second one, and then I'm going to focus it
Okay.
more specifically.
Okay. Well, just to talk about the album in general, and also, I mean, the thing about the title and the concept or the album or what you're experiencing, and I was actually curious to hear, because this is actually literally, for the audience, whoever might be watching this, and for me, literally, is my first time hearing your response because, right, just to give the background, I sent you,
Yeah.
I'm telling this to the viewers, whoever you are or they are, right, the link, and you said that you would listen and then we would do this. And so I have not yet heard your response. So this is my first time even hearing this much. So I'm curious about this. The album is both personal and what? Global, or what's the word? General, global, or could apply
Yeah.
to anyone's experience of COVID. However, it's obviously through the lens of my experience, which it can only be. I mean, if I wanted to put it in the frame of a this is the political statement about kind of thing, that would have been a different album, and I could do that. And I've done work in the past that was more broadly, obviously anything can only come from our own experiences. And here I'm tempted to already to talk about David Bowie in this, but I will try to kind of not do that yet. I'll bring that in later, maybe, because that's kind of a separate thing. But it's a very personal album at one, in one sense, just like, and this again, we're not going to focus on this today, I don't think, but the Angels of Time, which I know you listened to, and your response was that it seemed a very, very personal album.
Yeah. If I could jump in, Angels of Time, I heard as extremely personal. And in this instance, I heard it as a personal perspective on an experience that's shared by a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it says it might have that broader, I don't know if appeal is the word, because it's not like an appealing, happy album.
Yeah, it's not happy.
Work is very rarely happy.
Yeah.
But that's not because I'm just a gloomy, miserable, horrible, like a pessimist. I actually think of myself as this like exceedingly romantic optimist who's just constantly disappointed by everything.
Yeah.
And so that's why I'm, kicking against the pricks. Is that the expression I like? Just kicking against the wall. This is David Bowie comes in. I think Bowie was like this too. But
always crashing in the same car.
Yeah, man, always going round and round the hotel garage, man. And then, and then in the 80s, you hear him in the Moonage Daydream. I just rewatched the documentary the other day. He's like, I want to start the 80s with a happy, positive message. And then, 10 minutes later, he's like, what the am I doing? This isn't what I want to do. This isn't my music. These aren't my fans. I've got to do something. And then it's Tin
Yeah.
Machine, it's Hello Space Boy and all that. But so that's, so if it's kind of dark, it doesn't mean that it's hopeless. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to say to people that COVID was actually, this is going to go back to answering that first question or even the question before in some way.
Yeah.
And then I'll talk about the album, but this also, of course, everything connects.
Yeah.
Let me say this because I want to add some balance to this, that this is a general thing I'll say about my work. Many may listen to it and say, oh, that's dark, or that's depressing, or that's very serious or personal, or any of those things. And those things are true, maybe. My theme in general, I always tell people, and this also, we're not going to talk about this per se, but I've just compiled something that it's like 45 tracks of the last 4 years before and after COVID, literally from COVID 2020, the first question you asked me when I left my ex and did this album called Untitled, which is the start of this trajectory and living alone, the whole thing, COVID. That was the first album I made really to deal with COVID. And there's a song on there called COVID even. This is from 2020. 4 years later, I have an album called Before and After COVID. The COVID album, it's called Untitled, with the COVID track on it, and a track called Room, which I literally wrote in that room, in that rental space where I was miserable, depressed. And it was the first song I had written in months, which was unusual for me because I'm always making music because I was so out of it. I wasn't eating. I was like starving myself. I wasn't eating one meal or less a day. I had been drinking before that night. Like I actually stopped drinking. I stopped eating. I stopped doing everything. I was lying in bed. And I came out with that. I was like, I got to do something. I made this song called Room. And then I created this Untitled album. Most miserable time in my life, 2020 at that point in the summer. That's the first album of 2020 that starts this compilation. The compilation that I made, and it's going to go back to Before and After COVID. It starts with that and it ends with Before and After COVID. 4 years. It's literally, John, this is so strange. Untitled, the first COVID thing. Now I do Before and After COVID. Summer of 2020, summer of 2024. 4 years exactly. 4 years since I moved in here. July 1st marks the start of my 5th year in this place alone. So it's literally like this timing thing. It's really weird. It wasn't planned. Let me go back because I go on these things. I don't think my work is, firstly, it's not dark for the sake of being dark. Secondly, it's not gloomy for the sake of being gloomy. Thirdly, I'm an optimist who's just often disappointed. And also my art, if I may use that term, it sounds highfalutin for one to say that about one's own work, but the things that I do, the music that I make, and I'll talk about that later, but I think it's true of most artists. And when I say artists, I mean musicians, painters, dancers, whatever you want, writers. I also write fiction and went to Brown for creative writing. And Bowie had said this too, and Bowie's going to come up because Bowie's an influence and because Bowie's words, not just the music, right? We already had going around the hotel garage. Rewatching Moonage Daydream, he says the same thing. It's kind of like, this tension, these things in life, you have ups and downs, you have good and bad. You have, I always say yin and yang, light and dark. That gets back to what is my theme? If someone asked me 4, 5, 6 years ago, and someone asked me today the same thing before COVID, when I'm living in Fukuoka before COVID and after COVID, let me use that phrase. Same answer. Yin to yo, yin and yang, light and dark. Polarity. Zeros and ones, okay, if you will, if you want to put it into mathematical terms. There are different ways of interpreting this. And I'm going to use the thing that I think, the reason I say in to yo, which is Japanese for yin and yang, I don't like to say yin yang because in America, yin yang is like, oh, it's kung fu or it's martial arts or that's not what I mean. It's applied to those things and that's why, but that's not what I mean. And even if you go to Bruce Lee and you listen to his philosophical stuff, actually, he's getting to the philosophical side. Light and dark, right? Polarities. My work is influenced very highly by my way of thinking, I should say. Eastern ways of thinking, philosophy, not religion per se, but philosophy, Buddhism, Taoism, even from ancient China, and Hinduism, if you will. That's again, I don't like to use ISMs because then people think religion and people think, oh, you mean this, and they get images. No, let's break the image. But the philosophy of ancient India, the philosophy of ancient China, of ancient Japan, Zen Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism means the philosophical cultures that preceded Buddhism, because the Buddhism is 2,500 plus years old. Yin and yang, light and dark. Let me make this a little simpler. Where there's dark, you can see the light. And where there's light, you can see the dark. Let me explain this in simple terms. How is shadow cast?
Yeah.
You need the sun. Otherwise, there's no shadow, there's no dark. How do you see the stars in the sky? How do you see the moon in the sky, which is light?
Yeah.
It's got to be dark. The darker the sky is, the better you can see the stars and the moon. The more light there is, the more the shadow is cast from the trees and etc. This applies not only to literal light and dark. I think, philosophical, this applies to our lives. COVID, this is going to answer that question about, did we learn the lesson? You see, I'm actually not even forgetting the trail of the first question. All the things connect because you asked me, have we learned the lessons? I'm kind of going back to that. I'm going to connect it with the album and what it means to me. And your comment about my music being dark, or, like we feel like we're coming out and then we go back into the darkness. We do come out, we do go back in, we go out and in and out and in.
Yeah.
And that's in yin and yang, and that's life, like a wave, like a example. The weather in Japan lately, from where I'm living in Tokyo. Yesterday it was raining, pouring, miserable weather. I woke up with a sore neck and shoulder and I felt miserable. And I was kind of not in the greatest mood, and it was wet and nasty and, or crowded trains, whatever. Today I wake up, I feel fine. It's sunny out. I had a wonderful day. This is not unique to me. It's not unique to living in Tokyo. This is every human being on the planet.
Yeah.
We all have good days. We all have bad days. We all have things that go our way. We all have things that don't go our way. COVID was a dark spot for many of us. But there were definitely lessons we did learn, John, I think. And I'm going to look at that side of it now, because I want to suggest that the darkness, inside the darkness, there's light. That yin-yang symbol, to go back to this, but I'm going to put this into concrete, real-life terms. But that symbol is a dark half with a white spot in it, and a white half with a dark spot in it. And what that symbolizes is that within the darkness, there's light. Within the light, there's darkness. But that yin-yang symbol, the problem with it is that it's static on a piece of paper. And it's perfectly this and this and this and this in a circle and circle. But actually, that thing moves all the time. And those little dots in there get bigger and smaller, and those sides get bigger and smaller. And they may blend in various ways. That's the idea of it. So when you think about
what I'm thinking of something that's so totally unrelated.
That's great. Let's hear it. I'd love to.
So I remember when the Star Wars movie Revenge of the Sith came out.
Oh, it's already related. Let's talk.
And well,
of course, this is totally related.
It was a very positive review of the movie that I think appeared in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And one of the features that I forgot who wrote it, but one of the features that the reviewer really liked was that the story of that movie takes place sort of in the middle of the larger Star Wars story. Right. So it ends with the Empire in ascent. And it's, not unlike The Empire Strikes Back. The bad guys sort of win if you just look at it in the context of the movie itself. And there was this line in the review about how one of the things that was good about the Star Wars series is that it's a cycle. Empires rise, empires fall. And that's what I'm thinking of as, I'm not thinking about Star Wars, but I'm thinking about that concept of, you're talking about yin and yang, and forgive my pronunciation. Absolutely. But in so many aspects of life, there's that cycle.
Yes. And that's ancient Hindu philosophy right there.
Yeah.
And actually this goes to one of my albums from 2022. What the ancient Hindus or Indians, or whatever you want to call it, the Vedanta and philosophy, there's all words for it, is that the universe, the world, that's exactly it. And that's actually what karma is too. It's a cycle. And, cycle of birth and death, but it's not just birth and death, you see. It is, even within our lives, the cycle of birth and death within a human lifespan.
Yeah.
It's a cycle. The universe goes through its cycles, doesn't it? And the ancient Hindus, if you will, use that term, call this yuga or yug, Y-U-G or Y-U-G-A in English spelling. Yuga is a cycle, and it's like I think it's thousands or tens of thousands of years. It's like an impossible length of time for humans to conceive of. But we are said to be still in the era of, or the yug, the cycle, the era of Kali. Kali is this deity that's depicted with, it's a female deity with, like, do you know Kali?
Yeah.
Not
I
just
think of her the goddess of death.
the heads
Yeah.
in the hands
Right.
and the swords and the
Yeah.
bloody, horrible, warring, miserable, chaotic era. Bowie would love this too, right? Because he's kind of talks about chaos, and he calls it oh God, I talked about this in one of my talks. Not chaos. Chaos is sort of my word, but it's just everything is fractured and breaking apart. And this is that era, the era of this, and the era of violence, and the era of, lack of compassion. These kind of horrible things happening. Did the world get better or worse after COVID? We haven't gotten there yet. Oh boy. Whew. And my work,
So let's
but not this album.
Come back. Let's sort of. This is, I think, a very interesting part of the conversation. But something we haven't actually done yet is to describe to somebody who hasn't heard the album, what is it that they're hearing, or what is it that they're going to hear? And let me sort of ask two focused questions that are not meant to be long topics, but just like, I was talking to somebody about the album I was listening to. I didn't just sit down and listen to it all at once. And she asked me, well, what type of music is it? So I'm going to throw out a term, and I invite you to correct me, because I know a little bit about David Bowie. I know much less about music. But the other question, I'm going to describe that. And then the other question I want to ask is, at the very end, there's a panel that identifies all the different instruments that you play throughout the album, as well as some other, what I would call, tools that were used to make some of the, sonic experience, because it wasn't all instruments. So the first question is, so I described it as, well, to me, it sounds like industrial music. So A, correct me there, and B, can you, don't let them wait until the end of the album. What instruments do you play, and what are some of the other tools you use to create that sonic experience?
Absolutely. And it's, and in terms of process, John, too, it's not like I sit down and go, oh, I think I'll use this and make this sound and do it that way. A lot of it comes from improvisation. My recent work and this album, certainly. More
okay,
so.
All right. I'm going to interrupt you right away. Improvisation. You play 87 different instruments on this album.
Not that many.
But you can't possibly be improvising throughout this album. It seemed to me to involve an enormous amount of coordination.
It's almost all improvised, but the coordination part is arrangement.
Yeah.
I arrange the things that I do to create a finished product. Absolutely. That comes during the mix down process, the arranging process, because remember, I'm one person, right? So obviously I'm not doing ones, but this album,
you're making more than one sound that we're hearing at the same time. So
that's a layering of process. That's a layering process that they're not obviously created all at the same time. That comes in the mixing, arranging process. Mm-hmm. I can explain that process a little bit, maybe try to do it for the layman, if you will, for yourself, for people watching, for anyone, because actually it's a bit different than what most would be used to, I think, to begin with. Let's start with this. It's just me. So how do I do it? I mean, I could sit and play an acoustic guitar and sing, which I do sometimes too, and you've seen it. I just sometimes do my own, go to the park with my acoustic and play, and that's it. But this album is very layered and very dense and very thick pea soup, kind of thing. And that's not every album, but this album tends to be more on that end. And just to compare it to, say, the album before that you heard, I'm not talking about the theme, but just in terms of the music, right? It's a totally different experience, I think, overall from that album sonically. And there's, I also don't kind of determine, I think I'll do an album like this. To some extent, yes. I mean, I have a kind of idea, or I have a kind of sound concept I have when I start doing the thing. But actually, this album, interestingly, the evolution of it too, and I want to answer your question. The problem is there's so many things, I want to simply answer your question, but I also want to explain this. I sometimes release albums under the name of This Dark Shroud, which I think you know because you featured one of my This Dark Shroud videos on your page, which was The Dial is in the Bathroom.
Yeah.
This Dark Shroud is a side project name. It's the same person, it's the same, but it's just the side project name. I had planned on releasing this album originally in its original form, which was different, as This Dark Shroud. In its original form, it had some of the pieces you hear, like City Scrape, Welcome to the Noise. And I'm going to explain how that works and what those sounds are, because you're asking about, and the instruments and the sounds and how that works. So those kind of studio recorded kind of things were on there. And the second half of what that album would have been, but is not or was not,
Yeah.
were literally improvisations. Now, for those improvisations, I use backing tracks that I created on the computer, kind of made those backing tracks, and then I improvise atop them because I'm one person. So you've got some things going, and then I will, for example, play the piano, the keyboard. I will sing. I will loop my surin flute, my Indonesian bamboo flute. I'll do things like this. So that will be an improvisation. And it's a complete thing in itself. And I do that live when I perform live. Sometimes I do in my room and I record in the studio or at a live space. So that was the second half. What I ended up doing was I felt something told me these improvisations, I like them, but I want this to be like a studio album, if you will.
Yeah.
Those improvisations can go elsewhere because that's what they were, studio improvisations. So it kind of made a quick album for me because I had some studio tracks and I had some other things on there that ended up nicking. It changed actually over time, this album, quite a bit. So one by one, I kept creating these new tracks, which are the ones you heard on the album, and added them. And then one by one, I was subtracting the studio tracks until basically the studio tracks were all gone. I put them on a separate release in a separate format and had what you heard. Now, it was This Dark Shroud, and one of the final tracks I ended up creating for this album was the title track. So you see how it didn't happen in any sense in a linear fashion. It was called This Dark Shroud City Scraper. And if it had been that, the theme would have been something to do with, city life versus being out in sort of nature kind of thing. And that's part of the theme here that maybe I get into that in terms of the theme. It's not just the COVID thing, but it's that too. But I was doing a talk for my page and I started talking about before and after COVID and this and that. I used the sample from that talk in the track Before and After COVID. There was a rainstorm and you hear the rain in that track. And if you watch there's literally a rain thing. That's all me recording that. I do part of and this is going to the answer, instruments, gadgets, and sampling, as in what are called field recordings.
Mm-hmm.
It's a rainy day. I record the rain. Sometimes I take video, and I can take just the audio out of that, suck it out of the video, and mix it and put it into a track. So many of the things you hear on that LP, including the spoken word, some of the spoken word is just for the talks I do for YouTube, which in my room with nothing else. Some of what you hear in Japanese or other things where you hear other people talking, you hear footsteps moving across. If you have phones, you can hear. That's literally because I'm recording that outside somewhere. I'm in the park, I'm in somewhere, and basically I'm alone. So that sense of solitude or loneliness, or I don't remember the word you used, comes from isolation. Comes from the fact that I'm literally alone and I'm making these recordings. Sometimes they're videos and you don't see the video, but I take the audio out.
So I'm going to interrupt you again because you're touching on something I wanted to ask about. So two of the for a lack of a better term, devices that you use to make sound are your own voice.
Yes. I'm going to grab one of the devices right here. I can show you. Go ahead.
Okay.
This is small.
Your own voice, and then also I don't know what I was hearing, but there's a kind of staticky sound.
Grabbed it. Looks kind of like.
What are we looking at? What is that?
It's a KASTLE, like castle with a K.
Okay.
And this is, I don't know how to describe it exactly. It's basically it's actually a synthesizer, believe it or not. But you see how tiny it is, and it's obviously not hooking. I plug into a speaker and so on. This device, you tweak the knobs and it does different things. And it's really, you talk about Bowie's word was fragmentation, by the way, not chaos.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
fragmentation,
Yeah.
not fragmentation, not chaos, but it's like it's random
Yeah.
in a way. The more I've used it over the years, the more I've learned to control it and do different things with it. But sometimes it just does its own thing. And that's part of the beauty of it, because it's not, I'm going to play this note, I'm going to play this chord, which I can do on a piano or a guitar. This thing has a kind of random aspect to it. And I sometimes hook it to an effector pedal, which is for a guitar, which, right, you can make different sounds. And if I hook this to that, and you can see this on my YouTube page, where anyone who's familiar with like those things can see there's an effector pedal hooked in. I'm using this, and then I change the setting on the effector pedal. It gives me a different effect. I can also change the effects in Logic, where I mix after I've recorded. So this Castle noisemaker, it's an analog synthesizer that kind of makes these weird noises as you tweak, twirl, and I can also further effectorize it with either a pedal, or after in post-production, if you will, while I'm mixing, I can put different effects on and edit it differently, or put reverb or this or that. So this real,
Right.
a lot of that comes from this.
So great. So,
not all of it, though. Not all of it, though. I actually use different things, but this is one of the main sources of that I think you're talking about.
well,
Yeah.
okay. So I've never known such a device existed. But let me ask you about the purpose of using it, and something that, again, what entered my head when I was hearing that. And this is the one specific David Bowie reference that I intended to raise during this discussion.
I'm happy to hear them. Yeah.
I thought of the line from a song that is very, very unlike anything on this album, but the line is from All the Young Dudes.
All the Young Dudes, yeah.
Is there concrete all around, or is it in my head?
And that sounds and you asked about industrial music. That sounds industrial. That sounds industrial.
Well, yeah, right.
You asked about
not within
music.
The context of that song, but just the isolated, right? That concept. And I'm thinking that pops into my head as I'm listening to this, because the sound you're making with that device is and I don't know the musical word, but it is working against the sounds that you're making with your musical instruments. And it's in my mind, it's like the distraction of isolation. And then you introduce your own voice, and you mentioned the spoken word. And when I first, and I think it's fair to say that you do less singing on this album than a lot of your other works. Most of your voice is spoken. And when it first is introduced, I'm trying to listen. What is he saying? What is he saying? And it occurred to me pretty quickly that I'm not supposed to necessarily pick up on everything that you're saying. And so again, I'm thinking about the lockdown, and I'm thinking about how we had less and less communication with other human beings, and a lot of our expression was to the void. And even when, again, now I'm projecting my own personal experiences.
Please.
It was hard to break through that concrete all around, and even sort of think coherently. So there's a song that's fighting against this sound, this ominous sound that's sort of growing and then receding and growing and receding. So you're not in your head. I was going to ask, how off base am I? Was that? Yeah,
not at all. And number one, and this is my personal stance on anything that I do or anything that any artist does. I'm not talking about myself. That any Bowie or anything, is like, the listener or the reader, if it's a book, or the observer of a painting, if it's going to a museum, interprets work for his or herself. And the artist's, I was going to use the word job, but that's not the word. But when one creates a creation, once you've created it, it's out of your hands, and it's for an audience to interpret in each individual's way. Each perception is different. I think, though, that and I'm hearing you say this for the first time, and it's interesting for me to hear it. You said, am I off base? Well, firstly, absolutely. There is no off base anyway in my world, that there can't be. But what you say, totally, I mean, I didn't think of it. Like, I wasn't intentionally sitting down with the aim of saying, oh, I would like the listener to feel isolation, or I would like the listener to be confused, or I would like this or that. But at the same time, your response makes perfect sense to me. in terms of the context of the album, the sound and the
Yeah.
themes that just sort of are there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you another thought that entered my head when I was listening to it was a book that I read relatively recently that I had meant to read for years and years and years, and was The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's a very, I'm imagining, because I read it maybe last year. I imagine it's a very different experience reading it uh, after the internet was invented, because there are references to historic events and figures and very obscure medieval texts
Right.
that it occurred to me while I was reading it and while I was using my phone to look up what is this thing, we're not necessarily supposed to know. And I later read an interview with the author who was, it was an interview or an essay that he wrote from the 80s. So this is still prior to the internet.
Yeah.
And what he described, what he was trying to do was duplicate for the reader the experience of a character who was young. So the character who was young is hearing the older, they're medieval monks, right, talking about historical figures and obscure texts,
Right.
and the character who's the protagonist, or the at least the main protagonist, is supposed to himself be confused by what he's hearing, but he's hearing something that's real. And it's so when I asked if I was off base, and I, and again we go, all roads lead to David Bowie. What your philosophy is towards the experience of the listener was his, right? He doesn't, he's very elusive when he was asked about what did your song mean, and he's like, it's whatever you want it to mean. But at the same time, if you said, no, Maggiore, this was supposed to be the dance track, right? I mean, I don't think that was, even if I took that to be the, if I took it as such, I think that there was an intentionality behind what you were doing, and that's what I was trying to get at.
There was no intentionality behind it.
Okay.
No, but let me try to explain what I mean. In Bowie's case, he kind of plays the Bowie thing, which is like, like doing the characters or being like,
Yeah.
he's sort of, a little sly and tricky. But you know what, John, it's interesting. My own thoughts about Bowie and what he does in the interviews, depending on when they're from and so on, like rewatching Moonage Daydream, or I also rewatched The Last 5 Years again, that documentary. Maybe have you seen that, The Last 5 Years?
No, I'll tell you why. I have tried to see that documentary, and I have not been able to stream it where I live. So I suppose I could order
wonderful documentary. You'll love it once you get to see it. But what I wanted to say was, the more I listened to those old, obviously they're in the past interviews with Bowie, the less tricky he seems to me at all. It's like he's trick, but it's kind of like a wink, wink.
Yeah.
If you're listening carefully, you kind of know what I mean. It's kind of like, maybe because I'm so myself, it's like I don't like intentionally try to, I'm not being sly or tricky or clever in my music, and my answers to you are also not intended to be sly or tricky or clever, which Bowie would do with a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Yeah.
Clever, aren't I? And I'm going to be mysterious and elusive, and that's going to make you love me and be more interested in my music and buy my albums and come to my concerts and etc. He did the last interview he did ever, I think, with, who was it with? It was a writer, American writer.
Are you talking about the next day?
Yeah, the list of words. I mean, that kind of thing, But, Bowie actually, too, obviously our processes are probably, I think, quite different. Actually, the way he worked and the way I work, totally different. He worked with the band. He would compose things. He would make these little demos on his computer. He wasn't very good with the technological part as much. Like, I heard the demo of Sue, was it? Or no, 'Tis a Pity She Was a Whore, etc.
Okay.
So our processes are different. But I want to get back to your thing. You asked about intentionality. I kind of, the work dictates where it's going to go. That sounds really weird and mysterious and elusive. Have you ever heard artists talk about, I don't know where it comes from? and they use the term the muse with a capital S.
Yeah.
I don't want people to think I'm being kind of like, again, like saying I have some kind of like special access to this that other people don't have. I think everyone has access to this if you open yourself up to it. And that's how I feel about my work. Like I talked about how it's a process. Like the album changed, right? I said it was This Dark Shroud, it was City Scraper. Then I nicked the track. Then I put in the sample before and after COVID. And then I said, aha, this album is not This Dark Shroud. It's Marc Lowe. It's before and after
Yeah.
COVID because it's too personal to be This Dark Shroud. And then
Right.
again, it changed. And then again, I kept actually doing things. From there, I got a new direction. And then it started. So if there was any intentionality, it was dictated by each stage in the process, and that helped to direct me in a next direction. And that's the way I work. And the other thing
Okay.
I want to say is because I'm me and there's nobody, it's not a collaborative effort. You see,
Yeah.
Bowie is also collaborating with members. It was, hey, how's this riff? Or
Right.
if you see them talking, the band members talking about how they developed this, and Mike Garson played this, and Bowie said, oh, that's great, let's do this and that. I don't have that. It's all in my head. That's why maybe it feels claustrophobic when you listen,
Yeah.
because I am alone. I am after COVID. I am after breakup. I am living here alone for 4 years. I am using this music to stay sane in a way sometimes. I want to get back to the COVID thing and how it also could be relatable to others, because this is not just the story of one individual living in Tokyo, Marc Lowe. It's about COVID and before and after, and it's about the lessons we learned or didn't learn, and it's about the isolation we felt during the pandemic, and it's also about, and I'm not alone in this, many people, I think, changed. Something essential changed within them, and I'm one of them, where before COVID, the friends they had maybe became not, they kind of drifted. And they said,
Yeah.
I thought these were really close friends. I used to make special efforts to see them, to go out, to be at the events. And people during COVID, let's go to the bright side of COVID. And this sounds kind of a little bit cynical, but for some people, the bright side was, I hated going to those damn dinners and I don't have to go. I have an excuse.
Yeah.
Hated going to the meeting. I don't have to go to the meeting. I can do from home, shut the damn thing off, or do the meeting in my pajamas. And then afterwards, I can shut the computer off and spend time with my spouse, for example, or my dog,
Yeah.
or just not bother with that BS. So that was one thing. And then when COVID ended, you asked about the lessons. Let me say something about Tokyo, for example. Before COVID, I was here for 6 months before COVID. Trains are overcrowded. Unfortunately, lots of people jump in the train tracks, John. It's so stressful. High suicide rate, because there's so much stress, right? And all this other social problems, just like every place has it. Social problems. I know New York does too, has its social problems. There are different ones maybe. But so COVID comes. Let's look at the bright side of COVID, John. Trains get empty. People are at home. They have less stress. Guess what? Suicide rate goes way down. People aren't jumping to the tracks. They're at home chilling out or whatever.
Yeah.
What happens after COVID? Well, at first people slow to take their masks off. 2024, summer of 24, we're packed like sardines again. Another person jumped in the train track. They have a euphemism for it. It's like a human accident. Jinji. They say everyone knows what it means. It means someone jumped in the tracks. Sorry for the delay. This is like a weekly thing. It happens. Did we learn anything? I'm talking about just Tokyo now and Japan now. Went back to like before. So economically, of course, better. We've got the bars are open, people having fun. They're also enjoying themselves more. They're having social lives again. But let me go back one more thing. I'll let you talk because it's really important. Talking on the individual level and also the album, what you might sense from my experience, what the listener might sense from my experience that is in this album, in the sound and in the conceptual thing. You said isolation. That was your word. I think many people, after losing some friends, realizing they didn't need them or that it wasn't working or whatever happened, they were separated, or girlfriend, boyfriend, even spouse. There were divorces during the pandemic. There are divorces anyway. I had a breakup during the pandemic. Many people had these things. After In my case, it's a bit extreme because I was and still am living alone in this tiny place. During the pandemic, though, I went a full summer in 2021, not seeing a single person other than going to the convenience store or the
Yeah.
grocery store with my mask on. And thank you and goodbye. And that the talk is not about this, but in 2021, my main body of work was a tetralogy, 4 albums, it was about the COVID pandemic. And you said my music is dark, which it is, but the first album of the series, when I had just come out of that untitled album and breakup and living alone and trying to get over like the emotional stuff, plus I was scared, plus I didn't have much work, plus I'm living alone, plus I was isolated, I didn't have any friends, I didn't have anything. Hope was the title. Hope.
Yeah.
It wasn't
So,
called, like darkness and gloom. It was called Hope. So
yeah.
it was that little, I told you I'm a like hopeless optimist, hopeless romantic. Hope, but the album is extremely dark, and you might listen and say parts of it sound industrial or noisy or dark or whatever. So I want to say that.
So
Now,
what we've done, Mark, is
so yeah,
we've closed the circle. We've come back to where we started. And
well, everything you talked about cycles and Star Wars,
yeah,
it's a cycle, it's the Yuga,
right.
reincarnation.
So there's a bunch of other stuff I want to talk about, and I will leave this as sort of a mystery for the next time we talk. While you were talking, I pulled up the lyrics to "Up the Hill Backwards" from Scary Monsters, but I'll leave it as a mystery as to why. So, but I think this is actually a good time to stop this particular interview. I'll just tease for a future discussion. I wanted to get into a whole discussion of more general discussion of your approach to making music and art. But I think we've actually arrived at a good point to stop this discussion because we've sort of closed the circle on what we started with. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to say, Mark, thank you very much. I look forward to our next conversation. And this has been, I think this has been enlightening for me. And also, I think, I'm hoping that this is a great supplement to anybody who listens to the album. But I will leave on this note, though. I would suggest to anybody who happens to be seeing this, well, it's too late, right? I was going to say, listen to the album first.
Never too late.
If you got to this point in the interview, it's too late. So,
oh, that was what you wanted to say? So when I edit this, I should put that first.
Yeah. Put a little disclaimer
in the beginning and then at the end. And then we really have a circle, right? And then we really have a cycle here. Actually, let me just say this, right? Because just in terms of the album, you may have noticed or not, it opens and closes with before and after COVID. I don't know if you noticed that.
I did, yeah.
So that's also a cycle, John. That's also like that's also like the cycle. So that also in my work is a common thing. There are two different versions, right? The first has the spoken and the second elides the spoken. And I think it elides the piano maybe too. So that's also the cycle. Let me also say one other thing. You said, maybe I'm off with the yin yang. Yeah. And you mentioned Star Wars.
Yes.
Did you know that Yoda is, he's the Jedi Master, right?
Yes, yes.
Like the old Taoists or yoga. And if you read interviews with the director, that's based on yogic philosophy, Hindu philosophy, Yoda, the Force, and all that stuff. You look into this, John, you maybe not realize that whole use the Force thing. And Yoda is yoga, that whole kind of, he's like an old aging, like ascetic. That is Eastern philosophy influence, that whole Star Wars saga. So you were not off base one iota. You were closer than you realized. And you see how everything is connected. But I don't know how this connects to Bowie exactly this time. It's the only mystery left, the Star Wars. Except that Bowie was interested in Buddhism. Maybe that's a connection. But
we could save that discussion for another time because I think we could find the link.
Okay. Okay. And talking about open mysteries, we're going to talk about we're going to talk about Outside in that story, right? So that's also an open-ended thing, right? So there you go.
We've got an ongoing list of things to discuss. So
thanks, John. I really appreciate your time. Yeah, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you. This has been tremendous. So
likewise.
Mark, I'll talk to you soon, and even sooner we'll communicate online. So thank you.
Thank you, John.
All right.
Good day. Night.